So in this session, we're going to look at some of the miscellaneous new features that were added to PowerBuilder 2019. By miscellaneous, what I mean is that there are some features like the UI theming and the ribbon control and the C# development, which warranted sessions of their own. What I'm going to talk about here are a bunch of smaller features. While they're important, each individually wasn't worthy necessarily of a session of its own, but together they make what I think would be a nice session. So first, legal disclaimer, then we'll talk about the agenda. We'll go over the agenda here. So I'll talk about myself for a little bit. We're going to talk about some changes with the TX text control, some changes with the compressor object, extractor object, 64-bit enhancements, the standalone and compiler enhancements, using native PDF by default, some enhancements to the coder object, some source control enhancements, and then we'll have questions and answers. So first, a little bit about myself. I've been using PowerBuilder since version 1. I determined after I've been using it for a short time that this was something that I could make a living as, using as an independent contractor, and that's what I did for about 15 years. After that, decided it was time to go back working for a regular company, and I hired on with a company called Integrated Data Services. That was 14 years ago, and I'm still there. So in addition to PowerBuilder, the languages I'm fluent in are Oracle PL SQL, Java, C#, and C++, although I didn't list it there. I'm involved in a number of open source projects. I thought the three I listed there were probably of the most interest to PowerBuilder developers. A little bit about the company I work for, and so let's get into it. So in 2019, there are now three options for the rich text control that PowerBuilder uses in application. There is the built-in TX text control, which was in the earlier version, and there was an option there at the bottom, TX text control ActiveX 14 Professional Enterprise. That was if you went out and purchased your own license of TX text control. That allowed you to then use that license within PowerBuilder. What's changed now is that is the first option on the list is that there is now an OEM agreement between Appeon and the people who make TX text control, and so now Appeon is enabled to include it with PowerBuilder. And so if you select the first option, you're going to go back to the text control that's been used since PowerBuilder 10.5. So if you're concerned about backwards compatibility, that's certainly the option to use. And then you could always select the built-in RichTextEdit Control as well, although in later versions of PowerBuilder 2000, or at least in later versions of PowerBuilder, they will be making some enhancements. Actually, TX Text Control is making some enhancements to the control, such as full support for 64-bit. And that will get incorporated into the edition that is used in PowerBuilder. At that point, the advantages for using the built-in RichTextEdit Control start disappearing as the TX text control starts improving. You set this in the application properties. There's a couple new tabs that were added here. One for RichTextEdit, another one for themes. And I believe there's actually another one. This is from an earlier build. There's another one for native PDF that we'll be talking about later. As I mentioned, the TX Text Control X14, that's for if you have your own license of it and want to use your own license. I would not recommend this option going forward. It's there, but at some point it will probably be deprecated. Since the control is actually built in now. And then there's a built-in RichTextEdit Control. Also not recommended for use going forward. Today, if you're going to support 64-bit, you probably would need to use that. But as I mentioned earlier, in a later release, the TX text control will be updated to fully support 64-bit. 2019 R3, I guess, is what they're targeting. Okay, if you're going to deploy, if you're going to use the built-in TXT control, here's the list of files you need to deploy with your application. If you're going to use the built-in and RichTextEdit Control, then these are the files you'll need to deploy with your application. Okay, there's a new compressor object in 2019. This is for either compressing data in memory or files on the file system. So for the source here, that could be a folder name, it could be one or more files in an array, or it could just be a blob. Now the destination is going to depend on what the source is. If you pass in a file name or a list of file names or a folder name, what you're going to need to provide for the destination is a file name. If you pass in a blob, then what you're going to have to provide for the destination is a blob. The format, there's 4 options that are supported. Default is zip, so that's an optional argument. So if you don't provide it, then you'll get zip. But there's also 7-zip, gzip, and tar. And as we'll talk about here in a bit, tar is actually not a compression format. It's a storage format. It just takes multiple files. You wouldn't really use it for blob to begin with. You would use it for files, and what it does is it takes many files and combines them into one file, but it doesn't do any compression. So just something to be aware of. There's some events in the compressor object. So there's a start event. That's when you first tell it to do the compression. The start event will fire. When compression is complete, the finished event fires. There's a processing file event. So if you pass in an array or a folder, then as it processes each file, it will call this event and send the name of the file that it's processing. So if you want to provide feedback to your users as to what's going on, you can show them what files are currently being processed. Size completed, so there's another event that fires and it continuously updates with the amount of data that's been completed. And then there's an error event if something goes wrong. There's some properties on this object. The level indicates how much compression that the compressor object is going to attempt to do. So you can specify a greater compression. I list these here. The best would be the greatest compression, but that's going to take more time. The store is actually no compression at all. That just takes, like if you said it's like the tar format, but you could do the same thing with the other formats as well. You could say compression level store, and then it won't compress the files. It will just combine them into a single file. And then there's a spectrum from that up to best. So these are faster. That's why they're called fastest and fast. And these are more highly compressed, which is why they're called maximum and best. So it's a trade-off. The other thing is you can provide a password. Now if you set the password property on the compressor object when it does compression, it will apply that password to the file it generates. So that then when you give it to the user would have to supply that password in order to decompress the file. So just some information for if you're interested in how the different levels of compression are done. If you're using the zip format, once again I mentioned the store is no compression, but what they do for zip is they increase the number of fast bytes that are used, and they do more passes on the data to achieve greater compression. So for the fastest compression, it just uses 32 fast bytes and only does 1 pass. And actually it's the same thing for fast and normal. But when you get to maximum best, then it's using more fast bytes and it's doing more passes, which is what adds on to the time, but also provides the greater compression. 7-zip, somewhat similar. They don't really change the number of fast bytes used that much, but what they do is they vary the dictionary that's used for the compression. Gzip, what it does mainly is it increases the size of the dictionary and then increases the number of passes. And tar, as I mentioned, is a storage format. There's no compression, so it doesn't matter what you set the compression level to with tar. all you're going to get back is just a collection of the files without any compression. There's a compressor object, so naturally enough, there's an extractor object to extract the memory, the compressed memory or the compressed file into multiple files or a folder. It has an extract function, and once again, you've got the two different kinds of sources, or three. It's essentially files or memory, but files can, well, actually be a file or memory. It's what it gets, what the destination is that varies now. So you're going to send in a compressed file or a blob, and then your destination is going to be a folder. If you pass in a file, you'll get a folder back out. If you pass in a blob, then you'll get a blob back out. And then once again, we've got the formats, but there's actually more extraction formats supported than there are compression. So we've got the four that there's one more there. So we've got the four that were supported for compression: zip, 7-zip, gzip, and tar. But also for extraction, they support RAR and LZMA and LZMA86. Once again, there are events on the extractor object, and like the compressor object, there's a start and a finished, and a processing file, and a size completed. So it's basically the same events, and there's an error event too. Same events as for the compressor object, just mainly so you can just let if it's a long running process, you can let your users know what's going on. They won't think the whatever's happening is just frozen or something. Okay, let's talk about the 64-bit enhancements. Now this is more of a, this first one at least, is more of a bug fix than an enhancement. What happened with previous versions of PowerBuilder is in 64-bit mode, when you access the registry, it still accessed the WOW6432 node, which is the node that's used for 32-bit applications. So that was an error, and that's been fixed now. And so the registry functions, when you're running in 64-bit mode, do access the 64-bit registry. Now, the 64-bit registry supports much bigger numbers than the 32-bit registry. And in order to support that, this is an enhancement. A new reg long enumerated value has been added, which supports full 64-bit numbers. And then finally, 32-bit and 64-bit applications can coexist. They won't. There's no conflict in the runtimes. They won't. You won't have a 64-bit application try to load the runtime from a 32-bit application. Okay, standalone compiler enhancements. Here's where Appeon has kind of made a liar of me, because in my previous sessions I talked about how if you looked at the project painter in PowerBuilder and all the different options you had in the project painter, everything was, as of PowerBuilder 2017, the last release, they covered just about everything you could do in the project painter. The only thing they didn't cover was the ability to specify on a pebble by pebble basis whether you were going to create a PBD or DLL, or if you were going to put the code in the executable. And I suggested that at that time that's something that Appeon was never going to implement. Well, they implemented it. So now there's a new PD argument, and if you've used OrcaScript, you may be somewhat familiar with this approach. The PD argument takes in a string of yeses and nos, Y and N's specifically, to indicate whether or not the code should be compiled into a PBD or DLL. And I mentioned that because this would be pseudocode or machine code compile. So if you pass in yes, then it will compile to a PBD or DLL. If you pass in no, then the code will be moved to the executable. And it passes a series of flags, one for each pibble in order. Now the big difference between how it's done with OrcaScript and how it's done with this new PD argument is with OrcaScript, you had to provide a flag for every pibble. And with the PBD argument, you don't. You only have to provide arguments up through the last pibble where you want to specify that you want it in a PBD or that you want to put in the executable, I should say. Let's say if I say /pb, and this is assuming I have 3 pibbles. If I say /pbd y and y, then the first pibble and the last pibble get compiled as PBDs, and the second one gets included in the executable. If I say /pd no, it compiles everything in the executable. So far we haven't taken advantage of the optional nature of these flags. That's what we do here with this last one. Now remember, the default is yes. So if I say /pd no and there's 3 libraries, it'll see that first no and it'll say, okay, I'm not going to put that first pibble into a PBD. I'm going to put it in the exe. It doesn't see any flags for the remaining pibbles, so it automatically assumes the value is yes. And so in my case, my company's case, we had 100 plus pibbles, and we would create a PBD or DLL for every one except the first one. And this worked great. This would work great for us because that's what the arguments we would provide. We would say /pd no, and when it would exclude the first one from being converted into a PBD, and it would create PBDs for all the rest. So once again, you only have to provide that flag up through the last one where you want to say, put this in the executable. Okay. Here's where I was talking about that tab that didn't show in that first diagram, that first image, because it was shot from an earlier version. The first dialog was shot from PowerBuilder 2019. This is PowerBuilder 2019 R2. And so it's got the new PDF export option. And what you can do here, now I mentioned this in some PDF sessions I did last year. There was a flag you could set in the pb.ini file that would override the save as PDF options in the data windows and tell it to use the native PDF. This is a different way of doing it. It's actually, you set it on the application object. So if you click this and generate your application, then the application overrides the data window settings and will always use native PDF for PDF export. That way you don't have to worry about going in and editing every one of your data windows or doing modify on them at runtime to tell them to use native PDF. Okay, let's talk about the coder object. Now the coder object was in PowerBuilder 2017, and it did things like asymmetric and symmetric encryption. I'm sorry, that's a crypto object. The coder object does things like base64 encoding, URL encoding. They've added some new functions here. Base64 is a real popular way of doing encoding, but there are some algorithms that require base32 encoding. If you're going to do temporary one-time passwords, for something with Google Authenticator, which I do have a separate session on, the formal specification for that technology requires base32 encoding, and so now that's natively supported in PowerBuilder and decoding as well. The other one is base64 URL encoding and decoding. Now what this is it's a sort of a variation of base64. Base64 encoding ends up using characters that are not URL friendly. And so what base64 URL encoding does is it changes a couple characters in the alphabet that it uses to do the encoding, so that URL all the characters are URL friendly. And so like I said, it's a variation on base64. And this is another place where there's some technologies that specify that this particular means of encoding and decoding are used. One of them I can think of off the top of my head is JSON Web Tokens. JSON Web Tokens are base64 URL encoded. And then if you wanted to get the data back out of them, you would base64 URL decode. So that's now natively supported in PowerBuilder. There's some enhancements to source control for Subversion and Git. you can now view differences in the commit dialog. All you need to do is double click on the item in the commit dialog, and it'll open up the diff viewer and show you what the changes are. For subversion only, there's now support for the SVN needs lock property. What this is for is it deals with the fact that doing merges in PowerBuilder is very difficult because of the way that PowerBuilder it can't handle the extra characters that are put into the source code when there's a merge conflict, which forces you to do manual editing of the code. And so one way of preventing that from happening is that you require developers to lock a file before they modify it. So then if developer A locks the file, and when developer B goes to try to lock it, he gets told that developer A has it, and he doesn't end up getting the file and making changes to it. And the way you mandate that is through this SVN needs lock property. It says you can't make changes, you can't commit changes to the repository unless you first get a lock on the file. And so that developer B could go ahead and make his changes, but the subversion control system would automatically block him from committing those changes because he didn't get the lock first. And so that's now supported through PowerBuilder. And then there's support for multi-languages in file names and directories. And then one more for Git. There's support for branching. If you're not familiar with how Git works, you can, and it's pretty typical for people who are working with Git to decide that they're going to be working. They'll have like a main develop code line. And then if I'm going to be working on a particular feature, what I'll do is I'll create a branch. And I will then work on that branch. And I will do my commits just to that branch. It doesn't get committed into the main code line until I'm done. When I'm done, I'm tested it, everything looks good. I can then do, you do a commit, a push, but then you do a merge, and that takes the code from the branch and puts it back into the main code line. And that way, if I'm doing my work on this new feature, and for some reason we decide we're not going to actually use that code, or I don't get my code done by the release date, and I have to wait until the next release to release it, that gives the development shop the ability to go ahead and do a release that isn't affected by the changes I was making in that branch. And so anyway, that's what branching is about. That's now supported in PowerBuilder. You can switch between branches and as you need to work on different things, and then eventually commit and push and merge them into the main code line. Okay, I'm going to have a little bit of demo of a few of these new functions, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these miscellaneous enhancements. The first one, it's kind of hard to demonstrate because you really don't see that much of a difference in the presentation, but if you go to the application properties, there's your rich text edit tab. So in 2018, we had this built-in rich edit control, which is sort of the forward compatible version, which will they'll continue to enhance. Or now the new option, not this one where you have to have your own license, but this one, which is bringing back the capability that we had in PowerBuilder 10.5 through 12.6, which is use the OEM version of the TX text control, which is also frozen in time. So if there are enhancements to RTF, or if there's bug fixes, there's not that much that Appeon is going to be able to do about that, because this is a rather old version of the TX text control. It's I think it's version 15, and they might be on 19 now. But it does give you reverse compatibility. If you did an app in the 10.5 through 12.6 days that used a lot of rich text edit, and it wasn't working well with the Appeon's new control, you could revert back and use this one, and it would work fine. So that's about it for the rich text edit. Next item would be the compressor object and the decompressor object. So I have a little demo app here. And I'm just going to show some compression, but you notice I've got options for the compression level, the various formats. I have a non-visual object that sends events to the window when the events on the compressor object fire. So I'm going to compress something that's really big. This topo map, world topo map, is a 1/4 meg, and so we're going to compress that. And just say test, and so it's going to take a little while here for it to compress. And you can see the data being compressed as it goes, and then the start time, and eventually we'll have an end time here. Given that it's I believe it was a PNG format, it's already fairly well compressed, so Zip's really not going to be able to do much with it as far as compressing it. Yeah, the compression ratio ended up being 1:1. Actually ended up a little larger because of the zip wrapper, basically. But there you are. So it took 25 seconds to compress that file. We get better compression. I've got another file here. This is a big, just plain text file. It's 6 megs. It will go pretty quick. I'll just call that test 2. And zip, yeah, it was done that fast. So it was less than a second, and we got a 2.59 to 1 compression ratio out of that. So that's just kind of an idea of what you can do with compression now, compression and decompression. 64-bit enhancements, not really much to show. I guess the standalone compiler would be the next thing. So if you go into the project, you'll notice down here the /PD option that's new and the flags. So if you go to your libraries and you change these settings and come back, notice those flags have changed. So just like all the other options, as you change options here in the project painter, you'll see the different options in the preview here. So I'm going to copy this out, and I'm going to go to the directory the code's in, launch a command window here, and I'll say PBC190 and paste in that text right out of the project painter. I'm going to scroll this down a little bit so you can see what happened. So I said go, and we had yes, no, yes. So we said, then there's three pibbles. There's a they're down here a bit. There's a compiler pibble, compiler 1 and compiler 2. So what we got, we said yes. So create a pibble for the first one. Don't create a pibble for the second. Create a pibble for the third. So we have a compiler exe. There's a compiler for the first one. The second one was skipped, and there's the third one. If we change that to, well, let's delete those files first. Okay, and then we can say no, no, no. That just creates a single executable. There you go. Or I can say perhaps no, yes, yes. And so we get an executable, and we get PBDs for each of the 2 pibbles other than the first one. And lastly, you don't have to provide all the parameters, so I could just say no, and I get the same effect because yes is the default. So if I don't provide a parameter for the pibble, it will create a PBD from it. So I said no to the first one, and I just accepted the default yes for the others. So that's pretty much it for miscellaneous enhancements.